Legacy, lawyer and columnist Glenn Greenwald looks at President Bush's use of language in the war on terrorism. He argues that rhetoric, like good versus evil, is less effective today than in a post-9/11 environment. His talk from the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. is just under an hour and a half.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Tim Lynch, and I'm the director of Cato's Project on Criminal Justice. Today we want to take a few steps back from the news cycle and get some historical perspective on the overall impact of the Bush administration on our politics, on our law, and on our international relations. Over the past year, we have invited several authors who have written on this subject to come to Cato to discuss their thesis. Just a few weeks ago, Victor Gold was here to discuss his book, Invasion of the Party Snatchers. Gold served as the press secretary to Barry Goldwater, and his book is about how the party of Goldwater and Reagan has been taken over by big government neoconservatives and the religious right. My colleague Mike Tanner published a similar work called Leviathan on the Right, which I hope you saw outside on the conference table, which tells the story of how the Republican Revolution of 1994 and 1995 has unraveled over the past 10 years. And today I want to welcome Glenn Greenwald to discuss his new book, A Tragic Legacy, How a Good versus Evil Mentality Destroyed the Bush Presidency. This book debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. Now, before I introduce Mr. Greenwald, I do want to take just a minute or two to lay something of a foundation for this afternoon's discussion. But before I do that, I would ask those of you who came with cell phones, would you please double check, make sure that they are turned off as a courtesy to our speakers. Thank you. Now, when the subject is as big as the Bush record, we can't cover everything in the next hour or so, so we have to make some choices, and I think I'll get things started by putting a few subjects on the table. It seems to me that some of the most important topics that historians are going to be discussing 20, 30, and 40 years from now, the three main topics in my view are going to be obviously the war in Iraq, which started out as an effort to build a democracy in that country and which has since evolved into a bloody civil war. The second issue, which I think historians are going to be looking at, is the explosive growth of federal spending. Last week, Robert Samuelson, who's a columnist with the Washington Post, was lamenting the fact that the major presidential candidates are simply not discussing that issue. And it's one of the key issues that the next president is definitely going to face, runaway federal spending. Our budget analyst here at Cato, Chris Edwards, calls President Bush the trillion-dollar man because when he came into office, the budget for the federal government was already an astounding $2 trillion. And according to the White House budget projections, when he leaves office, the budget is going to be $3 trillion. So in just 8 short years, our government has blown through $1 trillion. Now, certainly the point can be made that Congress bears a lot of responsibility for that spending. That's obviously true. Today, we are looking at the Bush record. What was President Bush's role in the growth of federal spending? Was he trying to restrain Congress, or was he encouraging Congress to go ahead and spend? I think when historians look at the role of the White House, for example, in the Medicare prescription drug benefit, they're going to conclude that he was encouraging this growth in federal spending. The third topic that I think historians are going to be looking at is some of the shocking assertions of executive power that we've seen over the past 6 or 7 years. Last year, my colleague and I, Gene Healy and myself, we published a report for Cato called Power Surge, the Constitutional Record of George W. Bush, where we looked at some of these assertions of executive power. And our conclusion was that Bush's constitutional vision is inconsistent with the text, history, and structure of our Constitution. To me, one of the most important constitutional issues that has arisen since 9/11 has been the President's claim that he can arrest any person in the world, lock that person up in a military brig, and hold that person incommunicado. No access to family members, no access to lawyers, no access to the civilian court system via the great writ of habeas corpus. This is the enemy combatant controversy. Now, a lot of people I know say, well, what's different? In our past wars, we've taken prisoners and put them in prison camps. This is not the whole story. President Bush has made it clear that he's not just talking about people who are picked up on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has said, and his lawyers have gone into court to argue, that they consider the entire world, including all of the United States, to be a battlefield, and that the President is Commander-in-Chief, and therefore he can arrest anybody, including American citizens. This is what the Jose Padilla case is all about. If this precedent gets set, where the President can lock up an American citizen and put him in a military brig without access to counsel, without access to the civilian court system, it's a severe blow to the writ of habeas corpus. Now, there are many other issues to be sure. Our guest speakers can address whatever they like, and when we get to the question and answer portion of the program, you all can ask any questions you want to that's related to the Bush record. The format for our program today is simple. Glenn Greenwald is going to speak on his thesis for about 30 minutes. I am then going to introduce our guest commentator, Lee Casey. Mr. Casey will offer remarks for about 10 minutes. I will then give Mr. Greenwald 5 minutes to respond to anything that's been said, and then we're going to open it up and take your questions for about 10 or 15 minutes before we adjourn for lunch upstairs in the Cato Winter Garden. Now, Glenn Greenwald's story is pretty amazing for those of you who are not familiar with it. Just a few years ago, he was quietly practicing law at a major law firm. He became alarmed by the way in which this administration was responding to the problem of terrorism, so he started his own blog, which he calls Unclaimed Territory. And in a remarkably short period of time, he distinguished himself by providing readers with timely information and insight that are just not available elsewhere, and his readership just continues to grow. Just last Sunday, one of the New York Times columnists, Frank Rich, was citing one of Glenn Greenwald's blog post essays. He is now a contributing writer at Salon, and he's also a regular contributor to the American Conservative magazine. His first book was How Would a Patriot Act? And it was an instant bestseller. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, his new book, A Tragic Legacy, debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. So would you please welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Glenn Greenwald.
Good morning, and thank you for coming to this event this morning, and thank you to Tim for the introductory remarks, and also to the Cato Institute for sponsoring this event. I'm actually excited to be here. It's my first time here, and I'm excited because I've become a real admirer of the work that Cato does and has done for the last 6 years under the Bush presidency. And I think the fact that I'm here and have been invited here, and the fact that I hold those views of Cato that are almost uniformly positive illustrates an important point that's worth highlighting right at the beginning. You know, I write fairly often about the Bush administration and tend to write more often than not critically of the administration. And as a result, I have a lot of readers who span the ideological spectrum. I have libertarians who read my blog. I have conservatives who have become disenchanted with this administration who read my blog. And I have a lot of liberals who read my blog as well. And in those times when I have cited the Cato Institute and its work, and I did so in my most recent book several times, and I believe I did in my first book as well, and in those times when the Cato Institute has cited my work, which it has done on several occasions, a lot of the liberal readers that I have this sort of cognitive dissonance, you know, like, what are you doing with the Cato Institute, and why are you going to the Cato Institute? And I think, though, that most readers understand, because of the issues in which they're interested, including liberal readers, that the issues that have really been at the forefront of our political landscape over the past 6 years are really not issues grounded in the traditional ideological disputes, certainly not of the last decade or even the last several decades. And I argue in my book that the radicalism of the Bush presidency in so many ways has really engendered a political realignment in our country, so that the standard dichotomy now politically is no longer are you liberal or conservative in the way that those terms were used under the Clinton presidency and in prior presidencies. And instead, the real question is, are you a believer in the constitutional principles on which the country was founded, and a believer in the fact that no political leader can exercise vast and unchecked powers? Or do you believe that our government ought to be fundamentally restructured and vast new powers vested in the president in the name of the war on terror? I think that that question is really a question that lies at the center of virtually all of our most significant political disputes. And on those questions, I find myself on the side of the Cato Institute and other defenders of what in the 1990s was viewed as a more right-wing view of limited government power. Unfortunately, though, there are a lot of people in our country who have been parading around under the banner of limited government and distrust in federal government power throughout the 1990s who seem to have abandoned those principles entirely under this administration. If you go back and look at what the leading issues of the right-wing movement in this country were, particularly the people who claim to be adherents to small government principles, what you find is that the issues that they were talking about almost exclusively centered on things like an attorney general who is out of control and exercising federal power without any real checks. And a real bugaboo on the right throughout the 1990s was the fear over the fact that there was this secret court called the FISA court, and Bill Clinton could go to this court in secret and get warrants and start eavesdropping on your conversations. This was a grave threat to liberty, the fact that this court operated in secret and could give the president the power to eavesdrop on your conversations. And many of those same people who depicted this secret eavesdropping court and a rubber stamping court, both of which was true, as a grave threat to liberty are some of the most enthusiastic and boisterous supporters of George Bush's illegal program to spy on American citizens without any warrants of any kind. And so there's a lot of people who claim to believe in small government principles and in checks and balances and limited federal power who have abandoned those principles entirely. The Cato Institute has applied them with remarkable intellectual consistency, irrespective of the party of the president in power. And I think there are very few people who have done that, and I think it's commendable. And what I hope, and my commitment is that whoever the next president is, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican or whoever else, that those same principles that ought to be applied just as vigorously and just the same, because there are these principles that are at stake in our country. And I think the first order of business, regardless of ideological orientation, is to ensure that they're enforced. Regarding the book, I want to sort of begin with what really prompted me to want to do this kind of more general examination of the Bush presidency, because I do write about the Bush administration on an almost daily basis on my blog and in other venues. But one of the most interesting things is we have become sort of ossified in our view of the Bush administration. The shrinking number of supporters who support the president do so with great loyalty. And critics of the administration believe that this administration is one of the worst, if not the worst, in history. But if you actually go back and look at the early part of the administration, and I don't just mean prior to 9/11, but even in the aftermath of 9/11, it was a much different tone and a much different substantive approach that George Bush took, even to policies of terrorism. And for that reason, a president who was elected with many, many fewer votes than his opponent ended up with enormous popularity and enormous political power, not only as a result of 9/11, but as a result of the way that he approached it and the fact that there was a restrained tone to the beginning of the presidency and the way that he would approach 9/11. And yet we're at the point now where this is one of the most unsuccessful presidencies, one of the most unpopular presidencies, just in terms of pure polling data, that we've had in modern times. And examining the question of why that is, what happened that took this presidency that had the potential to really unify the country and revitalize a common sense of purpose, and how did it become one of the most divisive and one of the most destructive presidencies, was a question that was and is of great interest to me. And if you look now if you attempt now to find some common ground between Bush supporters and Bush critics, it's almost impossible to find any beliefs that the two disparate groups hold in common. And I actually began my book on an optimistic note by looking at the one principle that I think Bush critics and Bush opponents can agree upon, and that is that whatever else you think about this presidency, it is going to be one of the most consequential presidencies in American history, that the Bush legacy that he will leave when he leaves office in 2009 will be the legacy of the United States for many, many years to come, probably at least an entire generation. What I think is most helpful to do in terms of assessing this legacy is there's no shortage of opinions about what went wrong and how they went off course and the ways in which they went off course, but there's some facts that are indisputable and empirically true, and I think just standing alone quite revealing. And I think it's best always to begin with evidentiary matters, with clear, indisputable facts that present a picture politically. The first of which is, as I indicated, it is now the case that George Bush is far and away the most unpopular president in modern American history. Richard Nixon was 4 days before he resigned at 25%, and Bush has been at 26%. But in terms of how sustained the unpopularity is, in terms of the intensity of the unpopularity, there simply is no equal, just mathematically speaking, looking at the polling data, not even anything close in modern American history. We are a country that overwhelmingly believes that the president is untrustworthy, that he lacks judgment, that he deliberately deceived the country into the invasion of Iraq, and that really has lost faith almost entirely in George Bush as a person and in his presidency. And this has been an irreversible conclusion that the American population has reached, and that is bound to have very substantial effects on how our population and citizenry interacts with our government in the future. The second fact that is indisputable is the fact that in addition to his own presidency, he has virtually destroyed the Republican brand. If you look at polling data that examines the party identification of Americans in 2001 and 2002, there's a virtually even split between Republicans and Democrats, 43%, 43%, and obviously the last two elections have been 50-50 elections. And yet if you look now at the same polling data, what you find is that Democrats have opened up a 15 to 20 point lead in terms of party identification. And obviously the last election demonstrated that enormous numbers of Americans have fundamentally changed their minds about their views of the Democrat and especially the Republican Party, and that's almost all entirely traceable to George Bush. The third fact that is empirically indisputable is the fact that America's moral standing in the world is at an all-time low. And not only is it at an all-time low, it is wildly worse than it was even 5 years ago. The Pew Research poll just conducted a major international study surveying 49 countries and asked all sorts of questions about the perceptions that people have in the of the United States, both in absolute terms and comparatively to other countries. And in every single country, on every continent in the world, with very few exceptions, some Christian African countries who support or who have faith in the United States because we're aiding them in their conflicts with Muslim sects in Africa. But with very few exceptions, the perception of the world towards America has plummeted dramatically. We are viewed as a rogue superpower, as one of the greatest threats to peace, as a country that can no longer be trusted, with whom they don't want their government having any real interaction or alliances. It is an across-the-board and fundamental collapse, a transformation in the way that the United States is perceived in the world. That's just factually the case. The fourth fact is, whether or not that is a good thing or a bad thing or indifferent is something that people can debate and do debate. And there's a strain in our political culture that says, well, we don't care what the rest of the world thinks because we have to do what's right for Americans, and we're not going to get permission slips when we need to go invade countries and start the next wars. And there's that strain of political thought, and you can have that debate. That's a subjective debate. But what is objectively true is that our entire foreign policy, at least ostensibly, was based on the premise that the reason we need to invade Iraq and the reason we need to remake the Middle East is because our security is dependent upon changing perceptions in the world of the United States. I mean, that is the central rhetorical justification for virtually everything we've done. And so if you look at the premise of the Bush foreign policy, which is we need to change the way America is perceived in the world, presumably for the better, and if you look at the result that has been created by those policies, which is that America's moral standing in the world has never been lower, simply by the premise of the Bush worldview, by the Bush doctrine, our foreign policy has been a complete and total failure. And that's true not only because our security depends upon, as the president often says, how we're perceived in the world, but also because our policy, our objective, has been to spread democracy around the world and to ensure that world leaders are chosen based upon democratic elections. And there's hardly anything that you can think of that would be more self-destructive than trying to bring democratic elections to the world and make sure that world leaders are selected by the decisions of their populations, and at the same time pursuing policies that make the entire world hate us. Because what will happen, necessarily and logically, is that the democratic elections that we are proselytizing and spreading will result in the election of leaders who spout anti-American rhetoric and in fact are hostile to the United States. And you look at the elections that we've brought into the Middle East and into the Palestinian Authority and even into Iraq and other places, and you see the election of leaders who are actually hostile, and Lebanon as well, to American interest. And you look at leaders like Hugo Chavez, who come to the United Nations a month before his election and breach all diplomatic decorum by waving away the smell of sulfur that George Bush left at the podium the day before, and he then goes on to a smashing victory in his country because anti-Americanism will be a potent electoral tool the more our standing in the world collapses. And I think that's just indisputably true as well. The last indisputable fact, just empirically true, is the fact that we have a president of the United States who has embraced theories of his own power that are entirely unprecedented in American history, and certainly unprecedented since at least the Nixon administration. I mean, if you ask Dick Cheney, he himself would say that. I mean, his crusade before entering office was to restore the majesty of the executive to its proper place, which it occupied prior to the checks that Congress placed on the president in the aftermath of the Watergate abuses. So certainly the executive is at its highest point, certainly in post-World War II history, and I would suggest in modern American history as well. And so the challenge of someone who wants to understand the Bush legacy is to look at all those facts about what has happened to our country over the last 6 years and try and figure out what is the commonality that underlies all of these developments. What is the decision-making process, the thought process that has brought us to the point that we're currently at? If you ask most people in the political press, the people who go on television and write articles that most people read, if you ask them, well, what is George Bush's political philosophy? They'll tell you, well, he's a conservative. He's a conservative Republican. And I doubt I need to, given where we are, list all of the unconservative acts that the president has undertaken, from the wild spending increases, not just in terms of national security, but domestic as well, that Tim alluded to in his introductory remarks, as well as the complete evisceration of any principles of federalism. There's a whole slew of areas that have long been preserved to the states in order to regulate, from marriage to the use of medicine and medical marijuana to the Terry Schiavo case where Florida state law was being faithfully applied by a Florida state judge and the federal government intervened, to Oregon's assisted suicide policy, where the Bush administration has asserted the power of the federal government to federalize all of those areas, a principle or a behavior that could not be more antithetical to what conservatism claimed to stand for. And of course, the most significant one is the vast expansions of government power, of the belief that the U.S. government can engage in virtually unlimited surveillance of United States citizens in terms of what we do and how we communicate and with whom we communicate, even on our own soil. The ability to detain people, as Tim alluded to, without due process of any kind. The ability to operate in complete secrecy with virtually no oversight and no checks. These are principles that could not be more antithetical to, at least in theory, what conservatism claimed to espouse. And that leads to the question then, well, if conservatism, as traditionally understood, at least in theory, is not the guiding principle that has been animating the Bush administration, what is the guiding principle? Is it all just random, and is it just scattered, or is there a consistent worldview that has fueled all of this behavior? And what I did for the book was I went back and I read as many interviews with the president, as many speeches he and Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and the rest of his supporters have given, and looked at the justification for these actions. And what you see when you go and do that is that there's really one theme that predominates virtually our entire public discourse. And that is the theme that we, the United States, and our leaders believe in what is good, good in the pure and objective sense. And there are people and entities out in the world who are evil, pure evil, and they are our enemies. And the challenge of the government, the federal government, which embodies the good, and our political leaders who crusade for the good, is to gather as much power as possible in order to defeat and crush and annihilate the evil, the enemy. Because enemies and evil, by their nature, as this theory goes, cannot be accommodated or negotiated with or compromised with or achieve a coexistence with, because they're evil. And those who are evil want to destroy us. That's what their defining attribute is. And clearly this was the framework, the dualistic framework that was applied over and over and over again from the day of 9/11 up until today. And it resonated with Americans when it got applied to 9/11 because it's not very difficult to view the act of hijacking planes with civilians and flying them into office buildings in order to slaughter as many people as possible. It's not difficult to see that as an act of evil. And so that rhetoric resonated. But what happened was that template, that belief that everything can be divisible into pure good and pure evil, and that all we need to know is we need to destroy evil, began to be applied to every single political conflict and every single issue that we began to discuss, both foreign and domestic. And as the issues arose that were far more complex than simply identifying a villain, as we invaded Iraq and deposed the villain Saddam Hussein, and then were faced with an incredibly complex set of conflicts between all sorts of morally ambiguous actors, that good versus evil mentality left us completely lost. And if you look at the debate, the so-called debate that we had as a country prior to invading Iraq, what you see is that there was no debate, because the good versus evil mentality meant that you either supported the destruction of evil, or you yourself were indifferent to evil, or even worse, an aider and abetter of evil. And there really was no attempt to engage those people who turned out to be right, who were making rational arguments about all of the difficulties that would ensue and all of the dangers that we would unleash if we invaded that country. You can go back and look at the debate that took place. Those people were stigmatized and ignored because they could be, because they were on the side of evil or were indifferent to it and therefore ought not to be listened to. And this is really the animating justification for every policy that has occurred virtually over the last 6 years, and it is the predominant theme that dictates the discussions and the debates that we have in our public discourse. One of the interesting aspects of that is that, and I did a podcast interview here for the Cato site right before we began, and I get this question all the time, which is, well, what about Ronald Reagan? I mean, he called the Soviet Union the empire of the evil empire, and drew these moral distinctions as well. And it's true, he did. He believed, like most people, that there was good and evil in the world. But one of the things that Ronald Reagan did, and if you go back and read his speeches, you will see this, is in every single speech, he went out of his way to emphasize how urgently he believed it was necessary to avoid military conflict with the Soviet Union, how urgently he wanted to avoid war, how really desperate he was to find a way to achieve a negotiated peace with the Soviet Union, the same country that he had identified as the evil empire. And in fact, with Gorbachev many, many times and negotiated many, many agreements with him. And one of the things that's so interesting is, if you look at the people now who defend these Bush policies, who claim that, well, there's this whole litany of people who are so evil that we can't possibly negotiate with them. We just need to wage a series of wars, one after the next, against them. And their favorite insult is that if you think there's a way to avoid war, it means that you're Neville Chamberlain. You are the appeaser. You are the ones in 1938 who said, oh, let Hitler have Czechoslovakia and there's no reason to go to war with him. Every single evil country that they want to wage war on is the equivalent of Nazi Germany. Every leader that doesn't submit to America's will is the new Adolf Hitler. And every person who raises questions about or opposes whatever new war they have on their minds is the new Neville Chamberlain, guilty of appeasement and indifferent to evil. And if you go back and look at the debates that they had in the 1980s, these people now hold up Ronald Reagan as their icon. That's who they want as a leader, a strong, aggressive leader who will defend America in the world. But that isn't what they were saying about Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. They were calling Ronald Reagan the Neville Chamberlain of our country. And Newt Gingrich was saying that the meetings that he had with Gorbachev were the most dangerous meetings the world has held since Neville Chamberlain went and met with the Chancellor of Germany. Ronald Reagan was not a moral absolutist in terms of how he ruled and made decisions. He was a pragmatist about how to deal with the Soviet Union and America's other enemies. George Bush is the opposite. His view is grounded in moral absolutism. It does not change. It cannot change because he's convinced that he's on the road to righteousness and that he's engaged in a crusade that is moralistic first and foremost. And that, I do think, distinguishes the Bush mindset from every other president we've had, and it accounts for all of these policies. You know, one of the things that is so dangerous, there really are two attributes that are so dangerous about this good versus evil mindset. The belief that our leaders are not only devoted to justice, but really warriors for the good. The first one the first danger is that once you embrace this template, once you believe that you are on the side of this universal epic struggle of civilizations and you have discerned what is good and are waging battle, an existential battle against evil, by its very nature, that premise produces the conclusion that there can be no limits on the weapons that you use or the means you undertake in order to fight this battle. Because if our very existence is at stake, if our civilization and our freedoms are at risk from Islamic fascism or radical Islam or whatever term is in vogue for the day, if that really is true, then of course we ought to just dispense with all of the norms of civilization that we've been touting for the last several decades and interrogate with whatever means we can to extract information and break the law when it's necessary, because there is no more important crusade than defending good and defeating evil. And I think you see in every single one of these radical executive power theories and the arguments that are made on their behalf, and I think you'll see it when Mr. Casey speaks as well, the idea that we need to vest power in the president because he's engaged in a war that is so towering in its importance that the Constitution does not want him to be limited in any way, and that anything he does in pursuit of victory in that war is not only justifiable but also necessary. The other danger, the first danger being that once you accept this good versus evil mentality, that there are no limits on what the warriors for the good can do and should do in fighting it. The other danger is that we end up placing absolute faith in our political leaders because they're good. And if you accept the fact that George Bush is fighting a war of good versus evil, then we ought to let him eavesdrop on all of our conversations because we can rest easy knowing that he will never abuse that power because he only wants that power in order to defeat the evildoers, in order to eavesdrop on the terrorists, in order to listen in on those people who are threatening us. And we need to let him operate in secrecy. And we don't need to know what he's doing because once you accept that our leaders are grounded in moral righteousness, the rationale for secrecy not only disappears, but oversight becomes a danger because oversight means that we expose what our warriors for the good are doing to the evil ones. And I don't think it's much of a hyperbole. In fact, I don't think it's hyperbole at all to say that if you look at the defenders of this administration and of the believers in these Article 2 theories of executive power and the whole litany of abuses and lawbreaking over the last 6 years, the defense that will always be made is that we are at war and that all other considerations have to give way to that. John Yoo, who was at the Justice Department in the wake of September 11th and played a vital role in forming these executive power theories, is subject to a lot of abuse and criticism, and all of it is justified and more. But one of the things that I really appreciate about John Yoo is he is very intellectually honest. He is espousing theories that are very extremist at their core, And unlike others who pretend that there's still room for limits on the president, meaningful limits within this theory, John Yoo is very clear about the fact that these Article 2 theories that the Bush administration adopted do not actually allow for any limits whatsoever on the president's will or his decision-making with regard to how he exercises his commander-in-chief powers. And in order to illustrate that point, there was an interviewer who once asked him, well, under this theory that you're espousing, that the president, as the commander-in-chief, can make any decisions that he wants of any kind and cannot be limited in any way, not by the American people through laws enacted by their members, their representatives in Congress or by courts, wouldn't that mean that, for example, if the president decreed that our national security was enhanced by torturing children to the point of crushing their testicles or engaging in mass genocide, that your theory of executive power would necessarily mean that that was something the president could in fact do, that he would be able to crush the testicles of children, not just have authority to do it, but would be able to do it even if Congress passed a law that said it is a criminal offense to crush the testicles of children. Wouldn't your theory still say that the president as commander-in-chief has the power to do that? And he said, well, yes. I mean, it depends on his purpose in doing it. I mean, it couldn't be done sadistically or for entertainment. It would have to be because he believes that our national security would be enhanced by doing it. But if that were the case, then yes, Article 2 vests that power as the commander-in-chief in the president to do that. And while advocates of this theory will claim that there's nothing extraordinary about these theories, and it is very much in line with what others have done in the past, there is no room in this theory of power that for any real limits, meaningful checks on what the president can do. And obviously the best case of that is the FISA controversy that is in the news right now and has been in the news for the last 2 years. And I think it illustrates both of the dangers that I described in terms of no limits on the president and the blind faith that we end up placing in presidents when we adopt this mentality. The FISA controversy began, of course, when in 1977 we discovered that the eavesdropping power had been abused continuously by every president who exercised it, Democrat and Republican, for all sorts of improper purposes. And the American people got together, and in a bipartisan way, we decided that we want our government to eavesdrop on us, but we will allow them to do so, we trust them to do so, only with judicial oversight to ensure that they are doing so properly and for good ends. There was never a suggestion in the last 28 years that that law was unconstitutional, an improper encroachment in any way on what the president could do. Nothing. That law was enacted and abided by every president before George Bush. Even when Ronald Reagan was battling the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, he only eavesdropped on U.S. citizens in adherence to FISA. And the minute it was revealed that George Bush had been breaking the law and how he spies on us, the defense arose that, well, as commander-in-chief, he can break laws and do whatever he wants, including defying the will of the American people in order to protect us. And I think that illustrated that there really are no limits on what the defenders of these theories believe the president can do. The most recent controversy with the new revisions that have been enacted by the Democratic Congress that drastically expand the president's surveillance powers, which allow the president now, it was illegal for him to do it, but the Democratic Congress just made it legal, is now he now has the authority to eavesdrop on every single conversation that we as American citizens have in the United States with anyone outside of the United States, and to read every single email that we send or that we receive without any judicial oversight of any kind or judicial approval of any kind or congressional oversight of any kind. And I was on C-SPAN this morning with Mr. Casey's political partner, with whom he writes many articles, David Rifkin, talking about this law, and I was arguing why it was so dangerous. And of course, the opposite point was that Mr. Rifkin and many callers made many times was, oh, look, these threats of intrusion into our privacy or the idea that they're going to use this improperly, this is all conspiratorial fiction. These are very good and upstanding government employees and public servants at the National Security Agency, and George Bush doesn't want to read through your emails, or Alberto Gonzales doesn't want to listen in on your phone calls. The premise is these are good people fighting a war of good versus evil, and therefore we need not worry. We can place our blind faith, and it's blind because they can eavesdrop with no oversight. We just have to have faith that they are exercising this power properly and for good ends, and there is a large faction in our country that is willing to place blind faith in our leaders based on the premise that these leaders are good. And of course, that premise is the very opposite of the fundamental premise of the founding of our country and our Constitution, which is that in the United States, we do not trust political leaders to exercise unchecked power because they will invariably abuse it. And we've lost that ethos because we have been convinced that there is a war of good versus evil. There are enemies of all types, not just Muslim terrorists, but all sorts of enemies lurking out there, and we need the protection of government in order to save us from these enemies. And the more power we vest in the government, the more they can protect us, the better off they will be. And that has fundamentally changed the American system of government and our national character. And I think when you take a step back, this fundamental change in our national character and the political ethos that we have domestically and how we're perceived in the world really encapsulates what the Bush legacy is. And I think it will take at least a generation to recover from that if that damage can be reversed. And I think it's rooted in this mindset that has driven the Bush presidency. So thank you very much.
Okay, we are now going to have the benefit of hearing another perspective, and I believe our next speaker is well qualified to comment on Glenn Greenwald's book. He's a partner in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Baker and Hostetler, where he specializes in constitutional law, international human rights law, and regulatory law issues. Between 1986 and 1993, he served in various capacities in the federal government, including the Office of Legal Counsel, which is responsible for advising the Attorney General and the President on various issues of constitutional law and statutory interpretation. He also served in the Office of Legal Policy, and in that capacity, he was responsible for reviewing candidates for appointments to the federal bench. He's published dozens of articles in the major newspapers and in the academic journals on most of the controversies that have arisen over the last 6 or 7 years. Military tribunals, the NSA wiretapping program, Guantanamo Bay, and the controversial interrogation techniques. And we just saw him on the NewsHour just about a week ago where he was explaining the controversy involving President Bush's invocation of executive privilege. Would you please welcome our second speaker, Lee Casey.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, let me begin by saying that I have no desire to crush the testicles of children. And let me also note or take the opportunity to say something nice about Neville Chamberlain. It is true that many of us who support President Bush and have supported him over the past 6 years often point to the lead up to the Second World War in the 1930s as an era that should have taught us lessons about how we handle our foreign policy. Neville Chamberlain tends to take the brunt of the criticism because, of course, he came back from his meeting with Hitler in Munich in 1938 announcing peace for our time. There's actually quite a cogent argument to be made that Mr. Chamberlain understood very well the nature of the evil he was dealing with in Munich. And that indeed he used that nearly 2 years between that agreement and the outbreak of the Second World War to finally put Britain's armed forces on a war footing, or at least in a position where they could survive in the early parts of the war. At any rate, let me actually move to Mr. Greenwald's book because I had a few points. Let me begin by saying I think the book is well written, and it certainly makes you think, all of which is to the good. Whether, however, it offers insights into George W. Bush and his presidency depends, I think, very much upon your point of view. Obviously, in 10 minutes, I can't respond to all of Mr. Greenwald's claims, but there are a few points I'd like to make. For the most part, Mr. Greenwald presents a fairly conventional recitation of the anti-George W. Bush narrative. In his pages, we find a president of dubious legitimacy who used the September 11th attacks to manipulate a fearful American people as a means of increasing his own power. The arrogant son of privilege, captivated and then captured by the nefarious neocons who exploited certain unworthy aspects of American culture to launch an ill-judged crusade in Iraq and who will now not admit failure. The neocons, of course, are the book's particular villains. Its particular heroes are Howard Dean, the varying opponents of the Iraq War, and Lyndon Johnson, in an odd sort of way. Arguably, a tragic legacy's most innovative feature is to characterize George W. Bush as a Manichean, a modern rather than a medieval Manichee. The Manicheans, of course, were an important late antique sect who believed that if there is absolute good, then there must equally be absolute evil. They originated in Persia, and their beliefs were violently suppressed, at least in Western Europe, by the Albigensian Crusade. It was, of course, the binary nature of their theology that marked them out at the time, and it is that same binary mode of thought that Mr. Greenwald attributes to President Bush, and which serves as the essential architecture of his book. It is an intriguing point, although perhaps not as original as it may seem at first blush. The proposition that the world cannot be understood as black or white, or good or evil, but only in comforting shades of gray, has been one of the left's fundamental articles of faith throughout much of the post-war period and arguably before. One can, I think, fairly characterize many, if not most, of the right-left disputes of the past half-century as a battle over this very proposition's validity. Is the criminal evil in need of punishment or simply a victim of circumstance in need of understanding and rehabilitation? Was the Soviet Union an evil empire seeking global domination or simply a nation-state responding as nation-states do to perceived threats? In this regard, it seems to me, Mr. Bush's supposed binary approach to the world, which has in any case been honored in the breach as well as in the observance, as in the case of North Korea, proves him not so much a Manichean, but a relatively conventional conservative who understands that there is evil in the world and who is determined to call it as he sees it. Certainly, there is nothing unique or unprecedented about Mr. Bush's rhetoric in this area, however irritating his critics may find it. In particular, the idea that you must either be for us or against us has very deep roots in the American tradition. At the beginning of the Civil War, for example, Ulysses S. Grant wrote his wife that whatever may have been my political opinions before, I have but one sentiment now. That is, we have a government and laws and a flag, and they must all be sustained. There are but two parties now, traitors and patriots, and I want hereafter to be ranked with the latter, and I trust the stronger party. Of course, in the end, it was Grant that prevented the Confederate leadership from being tried for treason. The same can be said of the President's religious convictions. Mr. Greenwald clearly faults George W. Bush for his faith in God's purpose for himself and for the country. Assuming that the quotes and anecdotes recited in A Tragic Legacy do indeed give us a window into the President's soul, his beliefs also seem to me to be fairly conventional and are certainly rooted firmly in our collective past. The notion that the American experiment was and is particularly favored by the Almighty came ashore at Plymouth Rock and has sustained more than one president and the nation as a whole through difficult and challenging times. Even without the religious patina, however, it is clear that Mr. Greenwald believes that George W. Bush is just too damn sure of himself. This, too, is arguable. Is the President too sure of himself, or does he simply prefer to examine his doubts alone? In any case, it is on this topic that Mr. Greenwald moves to one of our most popular modern parlor games, remote psychoanalysis. It is, of course, widely reported that President Bush was something of a smart aleck in his youth, Indeed, he drank and raised hell well into his 30s. He is also a man with a stubborn streak, although whether you think this is a good or bad thing, it seems to me very much depends on what he is being stubborn about at any given time. Be that as it may, Mr. Greenwald attributes the President's alleged strong sense, quote, strong sense of certainty, superiority, and elite piety to his family background. Quote, that the President is accustomed, he tells us, to an environment that caters to his beliefs and desires is to be expected in light of his upbringing as the eldest son in a powerful and wealthy political family. Is this to be expected? To be honest, I didn't know very many eldest sons of powerful and wealthy political families in my youth, but throughout my very blue-collar upbringing in Detroit, I certainly knew plenty of drinkers, carousers, some who smarted off to the police, and at least one who not only challenged his father to go mano a mano, but who actually engaged him in a fist fight. This bill of particulars lodged against the President as proof of his unique indulgence and arrogance is more an indictment of adolescence and young adulthood than his social class. But the image of the spoiled rich kid who used family contacts to become president is very much part of the narrative. So is Mr. Greenwald's claim that the, quote, Bush movement has been devoted to the destruction of its enemies wherever they might be found, unquote. I must say, as an active and public supporter of the President, very much part of the, quote, Bush movement, I suppose, I take rather personal exception to this. The author supports his claim by asserting that, quote, virtually all significant political opponents of the President's, Howard Dean, Al Gore, John Kerry, the Clintons, were relentlessly branded as liars, mentally unstable, corrupt, seditious, and or sympathetic to the enemy. It is true that these individuals, as well as the others he names, including Richard Clark, Paul O'Neill, the war critic generals, Joe Wilson, Scott Ritter, Wesley Clark, John Murtha, Max Cleland, and John Paul Stevens, all have been challenged for their policy and legal positions, although mostly not by the President, and properly so. They have very often been wrong. I grant you that the debate has been heated. But it has been heated on both sides. How have these individuals suffered by that? In particular, how have they suffered any more than those of us who, in supporting the President, have been called militarists, torturers, had our intelligence, competence, integrity, morality, commitment to American values, the rule of law, and occasionally our chastity questioned? It may be trite to quote Harry Truman, but it is apt. If you cannot stand the heat, then stay out of the kitchen. Also consistent with the narrative, Mr. Greenwald claims that the Bush administration has cynically played upon people's fears as a means of justifying some monumental power grab. I, however, would suggest that it is the President's critics who have cynically stoked unfounded fears of government overreaching to portray the Bush presidency as some sort of proto-dictatorship, endangering our Republican form of government as a means of discrediting a man whose election to the presidency they never accepted in the first place. A man, in Mr. Greenwald's words, with a, quote, precarious claim to the presidency. Similarly unsupported, if central to his thesis, is Mr. Greenwald's assertion that, quote, the President and his supporters, that's me, locate new enemies continuously in every corner and seemingly on a daily basis and vow heightened wars against them because they must. Enemies are the essential sustenance of all Manichaean movements. Now, I've been paying pretty close attention for the past 6 years, and the enemies list has actually been fairly constant. And all were considered to be hostile to the United States before President Bush was elected in 2000. On the state level, of course, there is Iran, North Korea, and formerly Iraq, having pride of place, with Syria and until 2004 Libya trailing in a second tier. Non-state actors would include al-Qaeda and its allied jihadi networks, including the Taliban militia in Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan, as well as al-Qaeda affiliates in and around the Horn of Africa and Southeast Asia. All of these, I would note for the benefit of foreign policy realists, have been identified as enemies of the United States for good and sufficient geopolitical reasons, not because they stand in the way of some militant democracy project. I submit to you that Richelieu, Talleyrand, Metternich, and Bismarck all would have signed off on this list. Overall, if you are looking for a solid exposition of the left's objection to President Bush, the summa of the anti-Bush narrative, then a tragic legacy is an admirable choice. But if you are seeking a neutral assessment of the Bush presidency, I am afraid you must look elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to return now to Glenn Greenwald for 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes, I obviously can't address and won't attempt to all of the points, so I just want to highlight several of the most frequent myths that I think are voiced, that I think are susceptible to being looked at quickly. Mr. Casey alluded to at the end the fact that there's these people on the left who just always hate George Bush and won't give him a chance, and for that reason have been engaging in this fear-mongering campaign to heighten the danger that he poses. I think the exact opposite is true. If you look at the way in which the country coalesced around the president after 9/11, and not just for days or weeks after 9/11, but for months and even several years, what you see is that on a bipartisan basis, the country was eager to believe that George Bush could be a good president and was willing to support him in ways that they never would have been willing to do so in the absence of the September 11th attacks. People across the ideological spectrum, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, independents, Republicans, supported the president, supported the war in Iraq, because they placed their faith in the president because they wanted him as Americans to succeed. And the more George Bush has remained in the White House, the more public opinion has shifted dramatically to conclude that, in fact, he's a failure and untrustworthy. So the idea that they began hating George Bush and never gave him a chance is, I think, very empirically disproven, rather conclusively, by the opposite truth, which is that the country wanted George Bush to succeed. His presidency is a failure because they saw what he did with the faith that all Americans across the political spectrum were willing to place in him. The other issue that Mr. Casey alluded to was he invoked the specter of the left, those people who don't believe in good and evil, and they're moral relativists. And I'm not sure who he's referring to. I don't actually know any people who deny that there's such thing as good or evil in the world. And in fact, I affirmed the fact that there are good acts, Mother Teresa devoting her life to feeding starving children, or people who risk their life to save another. And there are evil acts like the September 11th attacks or genocide. But the idea that there is evil in the world only gets you to one point. Then the question becomes, what do you do about the evil? And what, as a political leader, becomes justifiable? And that's, I think, what distinguishes George Bush, not his recognition, shared by most people, that there's evil and good in the world, but the fact that the duty of the American government is to gain as much political power as possible in order to root out evil, to attack it and kill it, in order to promote the good, not simply for pragmatic reasons or for national security, but for moralistic reasons, to make the world, in George Bush's view, a better place. Mr. Casey indicated that I had faulted George Bush for his religious views. I did nothing of the sort. I think most American presidents have had religious views, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The difficulty begins when those religious views begin to form the justification for public policy. And the idea that the world is divided into good and evil, and that there's absolute imperatives to fight the evil no matter the cost, is not necessarily grounded in religious views. It can be grounded in all sorts of things, including nationalism. And I think the presidential candidate who most embodies it is one who's rather secular, and that's Rudy Giuliani, who views the world from the perspective of a zealous prosecutor, and believes that because he's on the side of good, battling criminals and evildoers, that maximum government power and authoritarian power is warranted for the same reason. It's the same Nietzschean view, not grounded in religion. And finally, Mr. Casey says, well, there's a slew of people who have been subjected to charges of being treasonous and seditious and insane because of their questioning of the leader during the lead up to the war. And he said, well, how have they suffered? I don't think they've suffered. I mean, I don't think it's particularly enjoyable to be labeled seditious as a result of your views or be accused of emboldening the enemy, but I agree that if you want to go out into the public and make political points and engage political debates, you need to be prepared to be attacked even with unfair insults. I think what has suffered is America and our public discourse, because the arguments that are being made and the rational objections to this president are being overridden and stifled by this simplistic notion that you're either with the president and therefore good, or you dissent from him and therefore you're on the side of evil. And our country engaged in the worst strategic disaster in its history and has had its national character transformed as the result of the degradation of our public discourse. And that, I think, is the real harm from these cartoon images overflowing in the way that we talk about political issues.
Okay, that was a sharp but civil exchange of views, which is just what we wanted. We're going to take some questions now. I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, one to each of our panelists. I'm going to ask Glenn Greenwald to identify the best thing that, even if it was by accident, that the Bush administration has done over the past 6 years, the best thing in terms of public policy. And I'll ask Lee Casey the other side of that question. What do you think is the most disturbing thing the Bush administration has done in terms of its impact on civil liberties or the Bill of Rights, something that you find disturbing, whether it's deliberate or even by accident? Glenn?
Well, it's interesting that Mr. Casey indicated that my book was this, sort of conventional leftist tract against George Bush, because I've received a lot of criticism from liberals and others who really dislike George Bush rather intensely, because I devote a good portion of the book to praising his behavior in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. If you go and look at what he said, and the reason that he was able to sustain unity and political popularity is because his instincts were quite commendable in the wake of 9/11. He emphasized that the enemy that we were fighting was not this broad roster of countries that needed to be attacked or a religion that was our enemy, but instead a very small band of fanatics. And that he vowed that not only would we be very focused in ensuring that others did not get swept into this conflict, people who are not actually our enemy, but that we would stay focused on this very narrow band of enemies, and that we would always adhere to American values in the crusade that we undertook, because, as he emphasized, what we were ultimately fighting for were American values, and that if we abandoned those values, no matter how well we did militarily, we would end up losing the war. And I think that premise, that America is more than just a landmass, but stands for political principles and values that even when we wage war, we must always adhere to, was a point that I believe he believed in and emphasized to great effect. And I think that his willingness, his eagerness to avoid vengeful warmongering calls and his pledge to make aggression restrained and adherent to our values was quite commendable.
Lee?
Well, a couple things. He, as I recall, signed McCain-Feingold, and I don't think he should have done that. But with respect to the war on terror, frankly, I think at the beginning, not giving captured enemy combatants, even though they are not entitled to the rights and privileges of prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions, something called an Article 5 hearing was a mistake. Those hearings actually are much more minimal than the current system that individuals are given at Guantanamo Bay. But having done that, I think would have suggested a certain flexibility that might have been might have redounded to the administration's benefit later on.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to call on people now. I have 3 requests. Please wait for the microphone to arrive so that everybody could hear your question. Second, please identify yourself and any affiliation that you might have, and then please keep your questions brief. We've got a full house, and we want to get to as many as possible. Right there on the corner.
My name is Steve Ternowski. I'm a presidential management fellow here in D.C. I'd really like to take the time to thank the panel for the very challenging opinions you've put forth. But in discussing in the litany of changes of constitutional and principles of our founding fathers that have undergone a revision, I think the one that is overlooked is the role of the military within our society. and the use of the military in political fora and the way that's changed. And what pricked up my ears was the term warriors for the good. And I couldn't help but fall on that about how, in so many aspects, the role of the military to the society it serves has been changed. You know, our soldiers are now warriors. We didn't use that term 5 years ago. There's a parade of field uniforms in civilian settings. That hasn't happened in any other American war. And I also think the use of the military as cover, be it the General Petraeus report as almost, you know, an impartial way to, you know, move forward in Iraq, and also the use of support the troops as almost a meat cleaver to hit someone over the head to make sure they don't question anything with policy. I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
I think it's a superb point, and I think you're absolutely right. One of the most striking things about our political discourse is how easily war is invoked as a foreign policy option. There's no sense of horror to it. There's no sense of urgency about avoiding it. Military force has become something that we just casually discuss as one of many options to resolve every problem. And I think one of the most underappreciated and unknown facts politically in America is that the founders were so concerned about a permanent military force, that they prohibited Congress from ever appropriating funds to the military for any longer than 2 years. And if they wanted to do it longer, they'd have to come back each time and justify why it was necessary. But if you look at your country as a warrior in the world and have the duty and responsibility and the right to run around enforcing moral principles, then you essentially do become a society of warriors, an imperialistic force, and the never-ending military deployments and occupations and bases that we have around the world, I think, attest to that. And I think it's a fundamentally different picture than what has happened before.
Lee?
Just a point. I mean, I think I think you may need to expand your historical perspective a little bit. You know, whether our soldiers have ever been called warriors, I think they probably have at some point in the last 200 years, and often. With respect to the greater presence of the military in uniforms, yeah, it's unusual if you take the last 20 years as your mark, but certainly during the Second World War, uniforms were omnipresent in civilian life. Indeed, fortunately, am not old enough to remember it directly, but I've certainly been told by those that do that very often young men were sent to the head of lines and treated very well as soldiers, very unlike the Vietnam experience. And I think this whole idea of we support the troops is a reaction to what happened to those who fought in Vietnam, and a correct reaction to simply say they are not, you know, they're off the table. It is not them that we should be arguing with or about. It is the policies, whether they should be at war, and which is a perfectly legitimate basis for argument. So I think, I guess I disagree that this is unusual.
Okay, down here.
John Cromarty. I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I was wondering if Mr. Casey could address a couple of the empirical foundations of Mr. Greenwald's book, since that sort of seems to be the purpose of the book. One, do you agree that, in fact, George Bush is one of the most unpopular presidents in history? And if so, why is that, since that seems to be what he wants to explain? And two, why is our standing in the world, in fact, as low as it's been in a long, long time, and why?
Sure. Well, first, let me say, you know, I have not done my own polls. I understand that the president's poll numbers are very low. I think that's to be expected. We're in a very unpopular war, which seems to be going on much longer than anyone expected, and the American people, and I'm quite sympathetic to this, have very little patience with nation building and don't quite see why these people can't simply behave like normal people. And that has resulted in a lot of focused anger at the president, and I think that accounts for his drop in the polls. I do not think it has been, you know, the quote-unquote excesses of the war on terror. In fact, I think if you look at, you know, the poll numbers available, much of that continues to be really quite popular with the American people. With respect to our standing overseas, again, it does depend on what country you're talking about. I think certainly the media in Europe and much of the rest of the world is very hostile to the United States, and I think that has had an impact on the populations there. Frankly, with respect to Europe, I think it is also to be expected. Europe needed us for 60 years after the Second World War. It does not believe it needs us now. As a result, I think we are seeing a certain amount of angst at our position in the world, a position that once they held, certainly in terms of the governing elites, and they quite frankly resent it very deeply. Obviously, we also have a great deal of unpopularity in the Islamic world. That too, frankly, I think was unavoidable. It is certainly true that only a tiny minority of Muslims in the world would support what al-Qaeda is doing, but it was inevitable, I think, that once we began to fight back, there would be a certain coalescing around what are in fact co-religionists, and this, along with a number of other factors, U.S. policy in the Middle East has had its ups and downs. Should we really be supporting the House of Saud the way we do, and other authoritarians there? That has affected it too. There's certainly a lot more work that can be done, but I don't think this is something unique, that this is something George Bush has caused. I think ultimately it has been caused by the developments both since the Second World War and the fact that we are engaged in a war right now. By the way, we were not enormously popular during the Vietnam War overseas.
Roger.
I'm Roger Pilon with the Cato Institute. Mr. Greenwald, as I listened to your critique, much of which I agree with, let me note, I was struck how it was replete with broadsides and short on specifics, especially except for a mention here and there. Let me just give you two examples. You said that John Yoo saw no limits on the Article 2 executive power of the president. I can only conclude you haven't either read his writings or understood them, because if you did, you would see that his writings are replete with constitutional restraints on executive power. The other was the FISA issue, and you seem to assume simply that FISA is constitutional and ignore an opinion such as the In Re sealed case from the FISA Appeals Court of 2002, which made it clear that the president has inherent power under Article 2 to engage in foreign intelligence gathering. You seem to simply either dismiss it or not even consider that possibility. So I would suggest that if we could have a little more detail, specifics, in particular constitutional detail, it might help your thesis.
Right. It's a little difficult to write a legal brief in a 20-minute oral presentation. And my intention was not to do that, nor do I think anyone here other than you would have wanted that. But what I will say is that in terms of Mr. Yoo, it's interesting that you criticized me for making statements without any specifics and then proceeded to say that I have no idea what John Yoo is talking about without identifying any specific misrepresentation that I've made. I've written numerous articles about John Yoo. I've read countless interviews that he's given and numerous articles that he's written and the memos that he authored while in the Bush Justice Department. And the theory of executive power is exactly what I described it to be. And the fact that he answered the question that he was asked that I identified specifically illustrated exactly what his theory is. Secondly, as far as FISA is concerned, the In Re sealed 2002 case, which you alluded to as though it was some sort of binding court case, that the discussion of FISA in that case is what we call dicta, which means that it's a reference to an issue that the court is simply noting in passing. There are two federal judges in this country who have looked at the warrantless eavesdropping program and have opined on whether or not it is legal in a way that is not dicta, but in fact is binding. The first is Judge Taylor in Michigan. The second is the judge in dissent on the appeal, both of whom concluded emphatically that the NSA spying program violates FISA and there is no defense to it. So those are the only two court cases that have actually ruled in a binding way on that legal question. Additionally, I wrote a book called How Would a Patriot Act, the topic of which was that the Bush theories of executive power, authored by John Yoo, are fundamentally inconsistent with our constitutional principles, and examined the history, both legally and factually, of FISA, and examined why the president's program is illegal. I didn't read from that book when I was here as part of my presentation, but if you're interested in my views as to why FISA is in fact constitutional and the president broke the law, I would refer you to that book.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Patrick McGee, and I blog on American Grand Strategy. I'd like to know if each of you could address the convenient ambiguity practiced by the Bush administration concerning its dual legal approach to terrorism regarding whether terrorism invokes the law of armed conflict in the way of unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, and such, or if it's a matter of international crimes such as slavery or piracy.
Lee?
Well, I think that the two are in fact consistent. I mean, the Bush administration, I think, correctly has invoked the laws of war. It has pursuant to a congressional authorization, become engaged, declared an armed conflict to which the laws of armed conflict apply. Those laws give the government certainly much more flexibility than the criminal law does. But that doesn't mean that the individuals we're dealing with are not also subject to the criminal law and could be prosecuted in normal criminal ways. The government, frankly, doesn't have to choose, or rather, it does have a choice. It can treat them under one set of laws and another. The laws of armed conflict in many ways are much harsher than the civil law. With respect, I think you're also asking whether terrorism is a crime like piracy and the slave trade, which is condemned by universal jurisdiction under international law. Arguably, yes, but it is that gets into a whole slew of issues that we aren't really addressing. But in terms of the state practice, at least arguably, yes, but it's far from clear.
You want to say something? Okay. Yes, on the aisle there. Wait for the mic. Further up.
Good afternoon. My name is Zachary Aronow. I'm finishing up an internship with the Rabin Group, and I'm a student at Brandeis. Mr. Casey, earlier you said you took a great exception to the possibility that the Bush movement has been launching a campaign of destruction against enemies. One of the things I've been doing is researching the case of a convicted former governor, Don Siegelman, and I gotta be honest, I think the circumstances surrounding this case suggest that there is a movement, not to mention the politicization of the Justice Department in general, like, for instance, the attorney who investigated Jerry Lewis, who is now a member of the law firm who is now a member of his law firm. But I mean, with Mr. Siegelman, I mean, back in 2002, he loses the election because a machine switches 6,000 ballots to Riley, and the Republican Attorney General, William Pryor, shuts down the recount. Mr. Pryor is now a federal judge. And then just recently, a Republican lawyer issued an affidavit stating that in a conversation with strategist Bill Canary, who is a friend and aide to Karl Rove, that his girls would that Karl had the Justice Department investigating Siegelman, and that his girls, his wife Laura Canary, who is a U.S. attorney, and Alice Martin, who filed indictment charges just before the primary, and subsequently was forced to drop them, and then the Middle District, and Laura Canary, of course, recused herself, never gave an explanation why. And also the fact, sorry,
Right,
so basically,
hard to follow. Wrap it up.
sorry, so basically, how do you say that there is no movement to crush enemies when there seems to, when the politicization of the Justice Department in general suggests that there is? And one more thing, documents were requested about that case, and they still haven't been delivered even after 10 days had passed.
10 whole days.
This was requested in July 17th, by the way.
I see. Well, let me, I am not familiar in any detail with the case you're talking about. My point was that the alleged campaign that Mr. Greenwald sees to destroy the president's enemies, either attacking them or otherwise, undercutting their credibility is in fact a myth. Now, if in fact there has been a prosecution that ought not to have been brought, that is something, frankly, that should be raised with the Justice Department Inspector General. I'm not saying I think that's what went on here, but there are processes to deal with allegations that individuals have been, for political reasons, targeted. And let me say that targeting someone for prosecution for political reasons is indeed a very serious abuse of government power. But to be honest, I'm a little dubious.
If I could just add quickly to that. Two examples that always have struck me is the first is when Paul O'Neill, the Treasury Secretary, left the administration, he began criticizing the administration rather harshly in some important ways. And within about 24 hours, the administration began threatening him with criminal prosecution because of some very technical and what proved to be fictitious violation of rules governing the handling of classified information, clearly an attempt to intimidate critics of the administration who thought that if they leave, they would be able to voice their opinion. The other critical issue that I think we see now is there was just an FBI raid on a former Justice Department lawyer at his home where they seized his children's computers and numerous documents in his home because they're trying to find out who it is, the whistleblowing hero who alerted the country to the fact that the administration has been spying on American citizens in violation of the law. We've had a very compliant press and a virtually passive Congress. Whistleblowers have been the sole source of information that we have about what this government has been doing behind its wall of secrecy, and there's now a clear attempt to intimidate people from invoking whistleblower procedures to inform Americans of when our government is breaking the law, and I think it's an incredibly dangerous and disturbing development.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Greenwald, in the beginning...
Identify yourself and any affiliation.
Chris Martinez. I'm with nobody in particular, just myself. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how national security and terrorism issues have really realigned the political parties, or at least the ideological spectrum in a lot of ways, and I agree with you, that now we're asking, as we've seen with conservatives who have refused to go wholesale along with national security agenda of the Bush administration, have been labeled as liberals oftentimes. With the media adopting a lot of this terminology and assuming this as the new template, do you see this as a more or less permanent or long-standing change in the way that we see conservatives versus liberals along that spectrum?
I really do. I think one of the, and it's a great question, I think there are two issues that are predominant now that have really been placed on the back burner previously prior to the Bush administration. One is, I think there's a real fundamental questioning and re-examination about what America's role in the world ought to be. Do we want to be this global hegemonic power that essentially dominates the world with military force? Do we want to continuously invade other countries and threaten other countries and make every aspect and region of the world essentially our dominion? And I think, and I think there are people on the right and people on the left who believe that that policy ought to be fundamentally re-examined. And I don't think it's a matter any longer of conservative versus liberal in the conventional sense as to whether or not we ought to be waging continuous wars. And I think the widespread and growing opposition to the invasion of Iraq is really fueling that realignment. And I think secondly, and absolutely, there will be a re-examination of the type of country we want to be. How does our political system work? What powers do we vest in the president? To what degree ought he be able to exercise power without real oversight? And I think these debates are going to continue with the same realignment just as vigorously, if not more so, regardless of whether the next president is a conservative or a liberal. The political disputes of the 1990s, gay rights and abortion and death penalty and affirmative action, they're still there, but they clearly have been pushed to the back burner, and the new issues that are predominating are engendering what I think is a very healthy political realignment.
I am afraid we have run out of time, but would you please give both of our speakers a good round of applause?
Glenn Greenwald is a contributing writer at Salon and writes Unclaimed Territory, a political blog. He's also the author of How Would a Patriot Act? For more of the author's writing, visit glenngreenwald.blogspot.com.